Our next panelist is Melanie Hauenstein. She is with UNDP's Bureau for Crisis Prevention and Recovery. You've been here only this year, but previously you've been in Sudan and the DRC, working both for UNDP and DPKO. So over to you, Melanie. I believe you are going to talk one thing about the virtuous cycle of GPI, of peace, but also of the more vicious cycles that UNDP is trying to address.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot also for the very interesting discussions before and the student presentations. And I think from a practical point of view, there were very many good points, and I will touch upon a couple of them. I will say a couple of things about peace and war, and then I will say a couple of things about the media, because I found this media study very interesting and perceptions. And then I will say a couple of words about, from the practical side, what does it mean to get from a vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle, because I very much agree with Mark that this is a very powerful and a very comprehensive index that I think brings a lot of interesting, important information together and confirms scientifically and academically what the positive relationship between development, economic growth, and peace. But in a different way, for me, it's from this perspective, it's also a little bit, it's an obvious relationship. And I think it's a little bit the chicken and egg question that we've heard before, because I could, from the last 5 years where I've worked, I mean, contrast that with, for example, in Congo, with a very powerful, vicious cycle of violence, and poverty, underdevelopment, sexual violence, whatever. So, I mean, the International Rescue Committee has estimated that over the last decade, 5 million people in Congo died because not of direct effects of the war, but of indirect effects of the war, and most of them preventable disease, because the war has destroyed the infrastructure, the health infrastructure, roads, and whatever, and conflict has made, I would say, the conflict and the end of the Mobutu regime has made Congo into one of the richest countries in the region in terms of natural resources, in terms of agricultural potential, into one of the poorest countries in the region. And we have a situation where in Congo you have one part of the country that has an agricultural surplus that is destroyed, or where farmers lose incentives of producing more, because there are no roads, there's no access to markets to bring the products to the markets. And in the other part of the country, you have WFP and others flying in expensive food assistance. So I think the index shows this relationship in a very global and in a very powerful way. But I think in order to understand and in order to get to the bottom of this chicken and egg situation and how to break this vicious circle, I think we need to a little bit more look at who benefits from violence, who benefits from war. And I think that's, there's an economic dimension, there's a political dimension. Paul Collier has made a lot of work on, the greed debate in war, and, mining companies in the east of Congo, armies around. I mean, the Congo was occupied by, it was the first African World War, what a lot of say, but by most of the neighbors of Congo were in Congo. Even after peace, people still exploit the economic resources of the Congo. And the same in Somalia. I mean, they're flourishing war economies. And that's apart from, I think, the very obvious observations that we have in terms of military exports and the defense industry. What I think is very important is that we see that in a couple of the students, and have mentioned that we look at that in a historic perspective. The transition from war to peace is not something that happens overnight. And it takes time, and it takes a lot of investment. And it takes investment on many levels. And I think, for example, just relating to the example of elections. If we talk about institution building, if we talk about nation building, if we talk about state building, for me, elections are the crucial starting point, despite all the critique and despite all the risks that you have with them. Because after a situation where people are, marginalized, excluded by conflict, it gives dignity, it gives legitimacy, and it gives, it's most of the time in countries like Congo, in Darfur, in Sudan, government is penetrated by people who are appointed by, warlords and other people. So, I think this is a very powerful intervention to make to start this change. Unfortunately, and that comes back to the positive, the positive approach of this index. I think a lot of these successes, for example, why we talk about all these problems in Congo. They had in 2006 historic elections. I worked in that process, and no one believed in it, but it happened. And it happened. Why? My observation was, people were tired of peace, and people voted for peace and against violence. And that set free a dynamics in that country that you could not stop by wars, by weapons. And I think that is one of the examples, but that does not get out, and that's why I like this media study so much. That doesn't get out in the media a lot. And I think this analysis, what you have done about the media and the correlation between the GPI and the media, is a very powerful tool that I think can be used much more to show on, what kind of news do people want to hear, especially from a continent like Africa. And I've come across a couple of weeks ago about a study about Africa that sort of disaggregates or groups African countries into different groups and identifies a group of 17 emerging countries that over the last 10 years or over the last decade have made huge improvements in terms of GDP growth, in terms of poverty reduction. And I brought a list of them: Botswana, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Lesotho, Mozambique, Namibia, Rwanda, South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia. All of these countries, there are more of them, still have problems, but something happened. And that comes back to the historic dimension of how long it takes and that we need to give it time. I'm from Germany. I look at Germany after the Second World War. The economic miracle happened at the end of the 50s, of the beginning of the 60s. The wars ended in 45. Germany didn't start off after the war like Congo after the dictatorship of Mobutu. And I think there's 1 minute? Oh, okay. There is much more emphasis that we need to put on that. I think I wrap up quickly. I have a couple of other points what we should do, but I think I skipped that, and maybe I have later on a couple of minutes to say something about that. I wanted to give, again, a little bit of critique about methodological critique about the indicators and some observations that I made. Military expenditure. I think one has to be very careful how you measure that. A lot of wars, and I thought it's interesting that you mentioned Libya, because that falls a little bit under this category, are fought through proxy groups. The Cold War was a very obvious example, but also in Sudan, for example, take Darfur. The government sort of supported financially and the Janjaweed and this would not show up in any data set, because that's not money that is military expenditure. And I think the same with Libya, that plays also a very interesting role in that region. Size of the army, I think, is also misleading. A lot of these countries have blown up armies, but that doesn't mean that the army is efficient. Congo is one of the best examples. We don't know how many people, you can talk more about that. We don't know how many people are in the Congolese army, and that is a problem. Then I would like to say something about the number of jailed persons. I really had a problem with that index. Because, and I used the example of sexual violence. And the problem we have with that in a lot of post-conflict countries. Congo is big time in the news, as you know, for that as well. The problem is that conflict destroys, all sorts of institutions, and that means legal structures, that means courts, that means legal systems. Then there's the problem of the independency of legal institutions, but then there's also a problem, the prison infrastructure and the prison structure. So if you come to this point, and that's what we have observed in Congo, that you go through the whole system, which is already really difficult to bring a perpetrator of sexual violence into prison. Then you find a prison, and I'm not joking, that doesn't have any doors or any windows. And where people, and the prison itself is a humanitarian problem, where people go out of the prison in order to get food and to not starve. And you can elaborate because I'm taking my time here off. And so I think we need to rethink that. And the last comment is on all of that in what we invest. And I think often investing in something like the army, where you have this problem of protection of civilians, where you have the army or the police that is part of the problem, and that is both in southern Sudan and in Congo. We found ourselves, I worked for also sort of a humanitarian, but the humanitarian coordinator in both countries, where you advocate, or where you could say you save money if you invest in an army. You save money and you save, in a way, lives that you would otherwise have to spend on humanitarian interventions, because these people are part of the problem. So, meaning security sector reform, army training, simple things, census of the army, payment of the army, a procurement system that makes the state functioning, and there's a list of 100 other things, but I stop here. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Melanie. And thank you also for the practical input from the DRC. I was wondering whether you could think a little bit about one of the comments from the IR group was on the use of regional organizations, whether you saw the AU perhaps, were they effective in your work? Could we use them more?